Welcome everyone to the last slot of the DAD conference. I hope everybody had a fantastic day so far, and thanks for tuning in to see me talk about identity. My name is Christos Matskas. I work for Microsoft. I'm a program manager for the identity division. I work in the developer advocacy team, and hopefully at the end of the session you'll walk out knowing how to write slightly more secure and slightly better software using the Microsoft Identity Platform. So if you like what you see today, and if you want to see more about identity, if you want to join us and build stuff live with us, we do have a Twitch channel, the 4 to 5 show, where we go every Monday and Friday at 4 p.m. or 5 p.m. So 4 p.m. UK time, 5 European and 8 a.m. Pacific. And we have guests. We build stuff live, and we show how you can use Microsoft Identity across various things. AWS Lambda with Microsoft Identity works. Azure, Google, anything you want. And today I'll give you a tour about how you can build things with the Microsoft Identity platform using various languages and solutions, and why you should be using it. That's the biggest question here, because this is where many companies in the past have got it super wrong. So as you can see here, we have a variety of companies, from doing pizzas all the way to editing pictures with Adobe. But all these companies in the past have fallen victims of bad user management, and therefore they got hacked. So I don't know if you have heard of Troy Hunt, or if you've seen Troy Hunt in action. He's a fantastic speaker, and he does quite a few conferences around the world trying to educate people how to actually write more secure software. He also has a fantastic website called Have I Been Pwned? And in that website, you can go and enter your email address, and you can find out whether your email address ever made it into one of these dumps that from data that got hacked from one of these websites. And every week, there's another website making the news. In fact, 2 weeks ago, one of the Caribbean banks made the news for putting transactions and customer data in an insecure storage account on Azure, hence exposing $500 billion dollars worth of transactions to the world. So people definitely get it wrong, and we want to make you make sure that you don't fall into that category. We want to fall in the pit of success when it comes to managing your identity. And by the way, I was one of these people that did write his own identity system back in 2007 when I wrote a CMS project for a customer. So I've been a victim of that fallacy of thinking I can do it better. And I will explain why it's so hard to do it right. So 10 billion accounts, by the way, that's nearly 10 billion accounts that have been exposed to security hacks. So I work for Microsoft Identity, and we have a couple of flavors of services that you can use, but the core product is Azure Active Directory, which is neither Azure nor Active Directory. It's a system that allows you to authenticate users to your enterprise. One of the numbers I want to highlight here is the 30 billion authentications per day. That is right. I had to check with marketing in case they made a mistake here with billions and millions, but no, that's 30 billion transactions a day. We authenticate that many users, and we can scale to insane numbers. Now, you might think, well, I only have 10 people in my company. I don't need that. We scale with that. So technically, you don't have to worry about that. But you as a developer never ever have to think, how is my database going to grow with my users? How is my website going to scale when it comes to authenticating 10,000 users at the same time? We will handle that for you. And I will skip the 345 monthly active users or 200,000 organizations, because as a developer, I don't care about that. I care about the scalability of the platform. So there are some questions. When your manager walks in and says, Tom, you're going to start working on this project, and one of the things that you have to do is authentication. Now, we know authentication is not a funny, sexy subject that everybody jumps up in excitement when they see it, but there are certain questions that you need to think. In the 200-item list of work items that you have to deal with, authentication is item 35. We want to make sure that you tick that box quickly and efficiently, and you move on. So when you are presented with this kind of challenge, some of the questions that you have to ask is there anything out there that can use today? Usually an enterprise will have Office, or they will have an Azure account or an Azure subscription, that means that by default, you get a free Azure Active Directory. A lot of people that have Microsoft 365 and Office 365 are totally unaware that there's an Azure Active Directory tenant behind them, so they will go and buy or pay for an extra service. You have a default identity provider there for you. As a developer, you also are going to ask the next best question, which is, am I going to be able to use the the languages I know or the frameworks I know to build something around the Microsoft Identity Platform? And yes, I will show you the SDKs and the languages that you can use it with. Does it support and integrate with my existing ASP.NET side or my Node side or my Java side? Yes, all these platforms are fully supported, and we have first-party support. Now, the last bit in the list is fantastic because you as a developer have never ever to think about how you're going to implement multi-factor authentication. How do you implement conditional access? And how do you add advanced features to your authentication out of the box? So, these are the things that if you ever had to roll them out yourselves are extremely complex. So just for an example, if you're trying to set up multi-factor authentication, and you probably have used multi-factor authentication in various websites, you know that the expectancy is to have either an email or a text message sending you some code to do that. So you as a developer have to implement those services and make sure that the codes are valid for a specific time and invalidate them and what have you. So there's a lot of complexity. In fact, we have 1,500 engineers working day in, day out, implementing these features for you, so you don't have to do that. So what does the Microsoft Identity Platform offer you? Obviously, reduce sign-in friction. You add a library, you configure something in Azure AD, and then your users can come to your website and easily onboard, sign in, sign up, and start using your application. Whether you have 1 user per day, whether you have 10 users or 1 million users, it doesn't really make any difference. The code is the same, and it would just scale with your platform. If you are using Azure Active Directory and you have access to organizational data like SharePoint, OneDrive, Graph, Active Directory, Outlook, whatever, any data within the organization is automatically available to you via the Microsoft Graph and other APIs. So once your user makes it through the gate, once they authenticate, then they have a whole set of data, a whole set of APIs that they can leverage to create more interactive, more immersive apps. Complying with IT is very, very important. Now, if you ever done ASP.NET Identity in the past, you know that you got databases with users littered all over the environment, and then somebody has to manage these. I've been in companies where people have left the organization, and 2 years later, they still had access to production systems only because their authentication setup was different to their organizational user management. So if you're using Azure Active Directory, once the user leaves the company, then they automatically get cut off with access to any and all systems that are using that thing. If your IT team wants to enforce conditional access and say, we only want users from Europe to be able to sign into the app or the specific section of the app, then they can enforce that. You as a developer never ever have to think about that. But from my perspective, securing the environment and making sure that users can only have access to the data they need to is very important. And the same for external users that come to use your application. You also want to safeguard that their data is secure. You don't want them to end up in one of Troy Hunt's blog posts saying how your data made it there. So no insecure password. You don't have to think about encrypting, hashing. I still have people conflating and confusing what encryption and what hashing is when it comes to dealing with passwords. You never ever have to deal with managing this data yourself. So how do you get started? What do you need to do to integrate with the Microsoft Identity Platform? Well, at the very core, you need to create an app registration inside Azure AD. You go into Azure AD either via the portal, or you can use our APIs, PowerShell, CLI, or even the Graph API, and create an app registration that in effect tells Azure AD that you have an intention to authenticate users against that. Now, you can also say that these users will be coming from a web app or from a desktop app or from a console app. As long as you provide the intent and you provide the platform details, then Azure AD knows how to deal with that. So once you do your app registration, then the next thing is to go and write some code. You're done with the Azure AD component. Now let's go and write some code. And here we give you a couple of options. First and foremost, we provide you with libraries out of the box. So we have MSAL, the Microsoft Authentication Library. That is the newest library that we recommend. So if you're very new, if you're starting a brand new project, then we want you to use the library. because that automatically integrates with Azure Active Directory or B2C, and gives the capability to benefit from all the built-in things: authentication, authorization, token acquisition, and then managing the token lifetime, token caching, and what have you. But if you feel advantageous, or if you already have an existing library that abides to OpenID Connect standards, then you can bring those libraries across. So if you already have a solution using OpenID Connect and OAuth 2, then you can use those libraries against Azure AD. You don't have to rip out your old code to bring MSAL into the play. I'll take a very quick break here to remind people that there's a bit of confusion around our libraries. We have a couple of flavors. We have ADAL, the old Azure Active Directory authentication library, and then MSAL. ADAL is still around. However, we earmarked that for deprecation. So as of June 2022, that library is not going to be supported anymore by Microsoft. So now is the time to start migrating apps from ADAL to MSAL. And I can see the confused look in Rick's face. Yes, ADAL is going away. So if you haven't started looking into the migration plans, then reach out to me, reach out to our team, and we'll help you do that, because your application will still work against ADAL, but you're not going to get security updates and what have you. So June 2022 is the time to think about earmarking, but start now. Now, once you got your integration there, there's a chance that you might have to go back to your Azure Active Directory and maybe configure some API access. Usually a front end will call an API, or your web app or your console app may be calling into Azure services. You need to enable those permissions into your app registration. It's not always required, but usually systems are a little bit more complex, and it's not just a single web app. So if you have to do that, then back in the app registration, you configure some API settings, and off you go. What are your options when it comes to authenticating users? I haven't talked about that yet, so let's cover this. If you are building a line of business application, if you are building a solution that is going to be used by your organizational users, internal users, then this is where Azure Active Directory comes into play. Azure AD is for work and school accounts. So if you are at contoso.com, if you're at microsoft.com, then Azure AD is the solution for you. But if you are building a mobile app, if you're building a web app, if you're building a forum for your friend, if you're building anything that needs to consume external users, right? You are Walmart, and you need to allow your customers to come in, sign in with an account, and buy stuff from you. Then Azure Active Directory B2C is that solution for you. So Azure AD is for organizational users. Azure Active Directory B2C is for consumers. And the nice thing about B2C is that at the very top level is just a username and password database. Simple as that. You don't have to do anything else. It's very simple. You configure your app registration. You say, I want to collect email and passwords, and allow people to sign in with that. However, you can also bring social media accounts. So if you want to enable your customers to sign in with their Facebook or Twitter account, then you can also do that. And because it uses OpenID Connect, it is extensible to use anything you want. In fact, we had one of our Twitch friends, streamers, they build a solution where they build a social media network for their followers, and they're using Twitch as the authentication provider. So the users of the platform will go into Twitch, they will sign in with their Twitch account, and they will be redirected back to B2C, which in effect says, oh, the user has signed in, now they can come back to your application. So any OpenID Connect compliant endpoint or provider can be used as an identity provider. Slides is a few slides too many. Right. So here I have a very simple, very basic JavaScript app. This is a single page app that is using MSAL.js 2.0 with Pixie. So we don't have to rely on implicit flow anymore. And implicit flow is the one that we wanted to avoid before because, yeah, I'm just right to read here. So implicit flow actually had to put a secret into your configuration. So as you can see here, my MSAL configuration points to my client ID. That's my app registration ID. My authority is my B2C tenant. And then my non-authority is my B2C tenant. And my redirect URI is where my tokens will come back. So once I authenticate against B2C, it redirects me back to my application. And I can now I have an account. So the code is fairly simple. This is a configure that. Think of that as a config file, right? And then inside my auth pop-up is where most of the magic takes place. I instantiate my MSAL object. And when I do my sign in down here, I'm logging in. In effect, I'm just pointing to a pop-up which will come up. If the login is successful, I'm handling the response, which in effect just populates my user name into the page. That's all it does, and changes the UI a little bit. I have a little bit of code here to handle what happens when the user forgets their password. It's a little bit of an unorthodox or unconventional way of thinking, but when the user says, I don't want to sign in, I forgot my password, it actually throws an error message. So we capture that error message, we check that it is the right error message, and we have a full list of those. So if it is I forgot my password policy, then we redirect the user to their forgot password, they reset their password, and when they come back again, we handle the response. And there's a sign out, which is a single line of code. You just call that and it removes all the locally cast information and signs you out from B2C. And finally, we have an edit profile. As you can see, these are one-liners. The MSAL library does all the hard lifting for you. So let's run the app and see it in action. npm start. And this will run on port 6420. So let me bring that up. Let's refresh the solution here. So we're cooking. As you can see, a sign-in page there. Let me just make this slightly bigger so everybody can see this. So if I sign in, you can see I have already configured my B2C to also use Twitter if you want that. But let's sign in with my local account. So I have an Outlook account, and I will sign into that. Now, because I already signed in before, it's not going to prompt me for two-factor authentication, but usually it prompts for two-factor authentication. So I get it on my phone, and there you go. I got my data back. I can go and edit my profile, which again points me back to my B2C. And it's simple one-liners. It's not complex to write the code, and it's available to me. Now, if you're using JavaScript, you can use the MSAL.js. We have libraries for Node, and we have libraries for Angular, and we're also working on React. So we have wrappers around these components, so you don't have to wrap it in a new React component. We'll give it to you out of the box. So whatever your front-end framework is, we provide you with appropriate libraries, and you can make it as advanced and complex as you want. But this is fairly simple. I can also point you the repo where the actual sample also calls into Graph. So it goes and uses the MSAL library to acquire a token for you, and also go and call an API behind the scenes. But I try to keep it simple so you can see that the actual authentication code is very, very little. Everything else is handling the UI and most of the changes. So let's go back to the slides, because I've got more exciting stuff to talk about, if you can call them exciting. Right. I love this picture. Come as you are. This is our message. You don't have to use any of our libraries, tools, and platforms to actually work with a Microsoft identity. Many of the things that we've done on the stream are actually using random technologies like Alexa to delete Azure resources on Azure, right? Alexa, go and delete my resource group, or and all these require some authentication. You can't touch anything on the cloud today without really authenticating users or acquiring permissions to interact with services. And that authentication is great when it's delegated to somebody else, and you don't have to worry about how you achieve it. I love this slide. It has not a single Microsoft element there, right? So you can work with Bitbucket and PyCharm and IntelliJ. In fact, we're working with the IntelliJ team, and we work with Rider to add Azure Active Directory as part of the Azure toolkit. So if you're using Rider today, you can actually go and create app registrations and add them to your .NET Core apps out of the box. You don't have to go to the portal and do that. We'll do it through the UI, the ID. Same for IntelliJ. We're bringing that in. And we don't really care where you're running, AWS, Google Cloud, or DigitalOcean. We will support you, and we support all these solutions. And we don't care about the language. We love any language, and we have MSAL libraries for all these frameworks. And if we don't, we have an API that you can call directly. And finally, we don't really care what you're running, whether it's serverless, Kubernetes, or bare metal. I just got pinged on Twitter that somebody actually wrote an Azure Functions blog with Microsoft Identity Web. So they can use Microsoft Identity Web as the middleware for Azure Functions to validate tokens, which is crazy, since it's not supposed to do that. But who says that because you can, you shouldn't, right? Now, if you are in our platform, if you are working with the Microsoft Identity Platform, then there are some added benefits. To be honest, if you are working with Azure and Visual Studio, then you get the end-to-end experience. I don't know if you heard about Managed Identities before. If you haven't, we did a fantastic session at .NET Conf a few weeks ago, and we'll be doing these a lot more going forward. But Managed Identity is one of these services that allows you to authenticate against Azure services without you really having to provide any credentials. It will use the locally cast credentials, whether you're running on Azure or your local machine, to authenticate. So if you're using Visual Studio, you've already signed in. And if you have access to your Azure subscription, it means that you can actually speak to your SQL Server through code without really having to authenticate. That's a fantastic experience because we're eliminating secrets. So we're taking it one level up, or the next level, by eliminating secrets from your solutions. And that's a bane in the lives of developers and enterprises. Again, I've been in many enterprises where config files were littered with secrets and API keys and configuration settings to databases and what have you, which meant that developers had access to production systems and production data. And you might say, well, what's the harm in that? I don't know if you remember the story from the San Francisco Public Services, where 5 years ago, one of their DBAs was fired, but he was allowed to go back to his desk. So one of his last acts of kindness was to encrypt the San Francisco Public Services database, the one that was responsible for handling tickets. So for about 7 weeks, everything was running for free on San Francisco because the system was down. And that means that giving developers access to production systems is a big problem. Now, as a developer, also, you don't want to be responsible for checking in your secrets into source control. And hopefully your company has means to capture that as part of your CI/CD process. But what if you didn't ever have to deal with secrets and use Managed Identity? So there you have it. You can we have a CI/CD on GitHub that actually calls into Key Vault using a service principal, which is an Azure Active Directory account, to grab all the secrets, populate your deployment in real time, and push those secrets out to your production environment, whatever environment. So there are some very, very good added benefits when you're in the Microsoft platform, but we don't lock you in, right? You can write code for anything and anyone, and it will still run on-prem, other cloud providers, or Microsoft. And yeah, you get some added benefits. So we're also trying to simplify signing. So one of the things that the MSAL library will do for me is if I'm storing my session in local storage, then it also enables single sign-on. So if I boot up another browser window, then it will know where the token cache is, and it will actually go and authenticate me. So from a user perspective, I use probably 30 different apps on a daily basis inside Azure. Inside my machine and inside Microsoft. I don't have once had to deal with authenticating, right? Either Azure Hello will authenticate me to the systems, and I get single sign-on for free, which means that I have totally forgotten my password. Thank God for password managers. Safeguarding access, again, user provisioning, it's important. So how do you add users to your platform, and how do you remove those users from your platform, and ensuring that they don't have access to unnecessary data. Building new experiences with Microsoft Graph. I will show you what Graph is. If you've never seen Graph before in action, I didn't even know what Graph was. I used to confuse GraphQL and MS Graph prior to joining the identity team. So I'm not embarrassed to admit that. So I'll give you a tour about Microsoft Graph. And finally, if you're an ISV, if you work for a partner, if you're building solutions for other people and not directly to your consumers, then one of the things that we have in the platform is that it's a marketplace. So we have huge companies like Dropbox and Salesforce publishing their apps into the the Microsoft Identity Marketplace. So when other customers or other partners need to download Salesforce, they have the guarantee that the Salesforce app that they're downloading is from Salesforce. So we have publisher verification. That brings confidence into your app. And you don't have to be a conglomerate like Salesforce. Anyone that publishes, and anyone can publish apps to the marketplace. It allows you to find a much wider audience. As I said, we have over 250,000 enterprises using Azure AD. And we give you various ways to integrate with single sign-on. Again, you as a developer don't have to think about single sign-on as long as you follow the best practices. So if your company has mobile or remote users, who doesn't these days? Then most likely they have phones and laptops. As long as these laptops and phones are in-tuned, so they're onboarded into the enterprise in-tune environment, then out of the box they get support for single sign-on. So again, I can pick up my phone and sign into Teams without ever having to think about signing in with my account. It will use the default authenticator system. It will authenticate me. It will validate. It will do two-factor authentication. And as a developer, if I was writing Teams or any other apps for Microsoft, the Microsoft tenant, I wouldn't have to think about how that SSO is going to work. It's handled behind the scenes. So we allow you to fall in the pit of success. So I'm going to skip that one because I show you a little bit about how you can get started. Secure by default, richer experiences. I think I have a quick mention here. So we talked about Azure AD and B2C. So the big difference about B2C is because it's addressing consumers, you want to make sure that the experience is a lot more consistent. So it looks a little bit weird if you're launching your app and then you go into the B2C login page, which is a different page and looks very different, and then you have to come back. So many enterprises that use B2C, and many people that use B2C, they want to customize the experience. So even though you're actually being redirected to a different page, that page can look and feel like part of your application, whether it's a mobile app or a web app. It doesn't have to look different. So we allow you to customize it. So if you're on Target or Safeway and buying stuff with your B2C account, it doesn't really look like you're going to B2C. It's just part of the Safeway login workflow. And that's very nice because it becomes a consumer product rather than the de facto Azure AD page that you see most of the times. And as I mentioned before, Azure AD B2C can also be used for some very complex scenarios. It's not just for a single tenanted, single app. You can have a web app that calls into multiple APIs that call into other services, all secured with B2C. And the example I will show you in a bit, it's a Blazor WASM with an API behind the scenes. So I have a Blazor WASM app that is using MSAL to authenticate my user against B2C. And then I have an API behind the scenes that also validates access tokens against the same B2C tenant, and then I can access my data. So I think without further ado, that's my next demo. Yeah, so let's jump into that. Demo time. Right, let's bring up my Blazor app. So Blazor WASM is fantastic. I think there were a few talks today during the session about Blazor server and Blazor WASM. So Blazor WASM is the client-only solution. So you write C# and it emits some nice JavaScript that runs on the browser. So here I have two solutions. Let's hide the API first. So the Blazor WASM, the templates now by default will give you that. So if you're running on .NET 5, you can see .NET new Blazor WASM authentication. You can just dash authentication, and you can say single org or single Azure AD B2C, and it will populate and it will bring all the libraries and dependencies here. So some of the major components, if I jump into my CS Prods, is that we wrap the MSAL library. So there's a little bit of interop between C# and JavaScript, and this library actually wraps all the ugliness. So you don't have to use MSAL.js. It will do it all for you. And program.cs, which is the entry point for our Blazor app, we have to configure some things about authentication. It may look a little bit of a complex code here, but I will very, very quickly just scan over this. What we do here, in effect, this is the authentication component, the lines 29 to 33. So what we say here is I want to add MSAL authentication, and I want to actually authenticate against Azure Active Directory B2C. I have my settings in my config file. And then I'm also saying I want to acquire an extra token for my API. So these 3 lines over here do all that for me. Up above, I have a custom authorization message handler, which we can use to default any calls to my API with the appropriate authentication headers. So every time I need to call my API, rather than me having to go and say, add this authorization header and add my bearer token and pass it on, it will do that all for me. So I added that, and then I have an HTTP client, right? So I'm instantiating an HTTP client for my server API, which points to my local API, and I'm passing my custom authorization message handler. So every time I need to do a call to that API, it will pass automatically the tokens I've acquired. Simple as that. And we have the scope up here, which is the API scope that we have defined inside our Azure Active Directory B2C. So this scope in effect says, go and get me an access token for this API in this tenant, and that's my scope over here. So access as user. Now let's jump very, very quickly to our API. So that's the Blazor app. You don't have to do anything else. The Blazor app is here. I mean, there are a couple of other smaller things, app settings, obviously, for Azure AD B2C. And you can see I already have Azure AD, so I can switch easily between the two or have both if I wanted to. In my index, I have my authentication reference. So a lot of code here. And in my pages, I have the authentication header that does the redirect for me. Again, that's part of the library, so I didn't have to write anything. It's just saying every time I need to authenticate, redirect me to the appropriate action. It's built into the library. So there's a question here. After registering for B2C, how do you then, published, it's fine. How do you then tell it to allow a Twitter, Google, or Facebook? Yeah, I can jump into my tenant and show you in a second. Let me go here. Let's jump to the portal. That's a very good question. And while this one is loading, let's go and run the app. So we have our Blazor app. So first we need to spin up the, let's jump the API. I wanted to show you the API. So the API is a standard .NET Core API. And here I have my weather forecast. Sorry, let's go to my CSProds. Single line of one library, one reference. It's Microsoft Addend.web, which is the newest library that wraps around MSAL and does authentication, authorization, and token handling for you. In app settings, we have the settings to our B2C. Easy as that. Again, we're pointing to the same instance. We just have a different app registration for the API that needs to be configured to accept the tokens. And then inside our startup, we have some configuration settings here. In effect, literally, if you wanted to simplify things, I'm doing some extra stuff here, but if I wanted to simplify things, all I would have to do was, if I were to hide that, Microsoft Addend.web makes it super, super simple. That's all you have to do. You just say, I want to do Microsoft Web API authentication configuration. Here, because we're using B2C, I would actually have to do bind directly to the B2C configuration, which is down here, because by default, it will look for Azure AD. So you can provide a name section inside there. And with a single line of code, you can actually go and do everything you need. If you're calling other APIs downstream, you can say enable add Microsoft Web API authentication, add Microsoft Web API calls Web API, and then so, if I were to call another API, all I have to do is just add this one here, and then we also have token caches for you to deal with and what have you. But let's uncomment the code. I commented. Let's go back so we can run the service. All right. There you go. .NET. Let me see. ls. Where are we? We are in the Blazor one. So let me open another terminal, which I think I have it here. We're in the API, so .NET run. This one is running. When do we use Identity Server with Azure AD B2C as an IDP in it? If you have to use Identity Server, then Azure AD B2C is an option as a backend provider, right? Specified. Version 3.1 was not found. Did I mess something up? I was playing around yesterday, so I could have broken things. Oh, I know what it is. I do not have 3.1 installed. Oh no, it's not .NET Core app, it's .NET 5. Chris, you're not on your game this morning. Ooh, problems. What is it? Honestly, it was running just fine yesterday. I changed. Missing method exception. You know what? Don't worry. And while this one's happening, let me jump into my B2C because there was a question. So Azure Active Directory B2C starts with a username and password database, right? And that's the simplest format. But then you can add additional providers. So you have to configure those providers yourself. Unfortunately, there's no way around it. But you only have to do it once. So if if you have multiple apps, then you might want to do that. But for this version of B2C, then what I need to do here is go into my identity providers, and you'll see a whole list of them. Out of the box, we provide you with this, but you can add any OpenID Connect provider. So as I said, Tweets is also another valid option. And as you can see, I have GitHub, Google, email is the default one, and Twitter set up. So these are set up ones. And then when I go into my my user flows, right? This is where I configure how people sign in and sign up and how they edit their profile. So if I jump into my sign in, sign up, which is a combined policy, if I go into my identity providers, I can select the ones I have already pre-configured. You can select none, or you can select all of them, but the default one is, signing in with an email. So if I check this one, the next time I go into my app, it will actually go and do it for me. I'm going to actually run it, because why not? And while this one is installing, it shouldn't require a restart. See, this is a live session, people. And while this one's happening, how do we support 2 or more IDPs at the same time in Blazor WASM and in backend APIs? That is a tricky question for the front end. Azure AD and B2C and Auth0, you can create different policies for all these, and then you can define how your users are signed in. I haven't tried it with Blazor WASM because there's a tricky thing with Blazor WASM. Blazor WASM needs to authenticate and acquire the tokens upfront, so it has to happen before you move on. So there's no incremental consent. You can't sign in the user, and then when they have to go into, say, a page, they need to look at the calendar, we prompt them for that permission. If you're running server-side code, then there is incremental consent where you say, the user signs in, they get the very basic OpenID and profile permissions, but when they have to actually move to a different page and we have to escalate their permissions, they need to call Graph or they need to call an API. At that point, MSAL will prompt the user to actually go and accept those permissions, and it will do that once. Once you consent, you're done. With Blazor, it's a lot trickier because you have to do it up front. There's no incremental consent because in effect it runs in the browser. It's a single page app, so it's trickier to do. I think the team is working to try to improve that experience. But if you notice in my program.cs, I had to pass the scope that was part of my authentication process. So not only did I ask for the user to sign in, but I also asked them to accept the scope or consent to the scope I needed. For the APIs, again, there's a way to do it. I can point you to samples if you want to later on, Asith. So make sure to ping me afterwards. Right, I've installed 3.1, so let's see what happens this time. Let's go back to the app. Honestly, it was running yesterday. I don't know why. Right, .NET. Still saying 12 problems there. There you go, no problems. It's running now, so 8080 the port. Let's go into our Blazor web. And which version am I targeting here? Okay, right, cool. So now if I switch the port and then say .NET run, and let's bring the browser up. That is my Blazor app. Okay, I can log in. And I wasn't prompted because I had already authenticated before. And now if I call my fetch data, it works. There you go. So both my front end and my back end are authenticated. Thank you for the clapping. That's fantastic. Yeah, I made it work. Right. Okay. So that's it. I want to quickly move on to talk a little bit about graph. And I know we have like 3 minutes left, so I'll be fast. Very, very quickly. I love the slide. If Marsha can do it, then definitely Bob can do it too. I will show the slides later so you can devour them. But Microsoft.web is built on top of MSAL, so you don't have to deal with ASP.NET Identity separately and then download another library to go and get the tokens. Microsoft.web makes it super simple to get started, but you don't have to use that. If you are in other frameworks and languages, then we have the MSAL library for you. And then finally, you can bring your own libraries, PyOIDC, OpenID Connect, Passport for Node, and what have you. We support all of these. I'm going to skim through these because I don't have time and I want to jump quickly to the graph. But we have significantly simplified everything from acquiring tokens to storing these tokens, and then even validating that the API calls have the right permission. So there's a single line of code that's like a HTTP context.verify user has appropriate scopes, and then you pass the scopes, and that will do all the unraveling of the token, getting the scopes, making sure that these scopes exist in the current token, and then either 403 and sending the user back to a message saying you don't have the permissions, or actually allowing the user to go forward with a 200. What is graph? So graph, I will give you the best example I like to use all the time. If you are using Outlook in an organization and you send emails all the time, then you notice that every time you say, I want to send a new email, and you go to the to field, it will prompt you with some people. These people are usually the people that you work most with. So the 10 people that you always send emails will be always at the top, because Outlook does a graph call and looks into your object and says, hey, who does Christos work with all the time? Oh, it's JP. Right, JP goes at the top. His manager goes second, and then all the other people go beyond that. So what it tries to do is bring that organizational data to the forefront and create more intuitive, more immersive solutions for your users. It makes my life a lot easier when I don't have to scan the GAL in Outlook and Azure Active Directory every time to find somebody. Outlook is trying to be clever for me, and it can build all sorts of things. Isaac Levin and Scott Hanselman demoed something at Build this year where the lights in the room were changing based on status on Teams. So if Scott Hanselman was in a call with his team, then his kids knew that he was busy because the lights were red. If you are free, the lights turn yellow or green or white, whatever you want to change them. And that's all driven by graph. So graph makes the call, looks at your current status and feeds the data back into whatever front end you want to do. You can build so many immersive apps and solutions. It's fantastic. Anything that is part of the organizational data, SharePoint, OneDrive, Dynamics, CRM, everything, Outlook, all available to you. And I will very, very quickly jump to do one short demo in the Graph Explorer. If you never used Graph Explorer before, it's a fantastic way to get started with Graph, aka.ms, GE. Is where graph lives. Let's see if it authenticates me. Usually prompts for authentication. Let's see, it picked up my Microsoft account. So that's dangerous. So I'm running the query here. I can see this is all the information. I'm not lying, I'm a program manager. And this is the data that brings back. But the nice thing I like about this one is that it will actually give you, what? Code snippet not working? The demo guys are not good for me today. see beta. Right. Oh, the beta I get. Okay, interesting. That must be a glitch. So this one is like, oh, I know what the data is I want to get. Now, how do I get it? And we give you the nice snippets here. So whether you want to do the API calls yourself or whether you want to use the graph client, even Objective-C, we will give you the code snippets, and there's a fantastic documentation. As for the query I mentioned before, if you go into people, and this is what Outlook does for me. Hey, who do you work with all the time? Let's run it. And interesting, the code snippets are not working for one. Oh, I'll have a chat with Daryl. So there you go. This one is actually doing the exact same thing. It calls the people I work with, JP. I'm not lying. I'm with him 8 hours a day on the phone. And then I can get the code. It's very few lines of code. And you can customize it, extend it, filter, expand objects, and do some very complex show data queries up here to get the data you need, or you can filter them down here. So, Graph Explorer is fantastic. It definitely brings a lot of goodness into that, and can also automate things for you, right? It's not just for pulling data, but it's also for building and adding data to your Azure AD or your SharePoint or your OneDrive or what have you. And the last slide will be, again, if you like what you saw today, and if you have more questions, some of them on the chat today, if I didn't answer them well, then make sure to reach out to me at the 4to5show, it's 4to5show at Microsoft.com, or join us on the stream Mondays and Fridays and let us know. But that is me. Hopefully a quick tour about the Microsoft Identity, what it can do for you and why you should be using it. Please don't enroll your own authentication. And that's the end of the session with 2 minutes over. I'm happy to stick around if you have any more questions, but thanks everyone for attending. Appreciate that. It was a blast. Thank you for having me again. And I appreciate Rick being behind the scenes supporting me. But have a great holiday, everyone, and hope to see you soon.